and welcome back to our program. Let's continue our conversation with Jørgen Olsen, agroecology professor at Aarhus University. So let's continue where we left off. Thank you so much once again for being here.
It's my pleasure.
And we were talking about the greenhouse gases. Now just to finish up the topic a little bit more about its relationship with the livestock. There's quite a... how can I explain? There is not a consensus about the percentage.
You can find all sorts of numbers if you Google things.
Yes.
And some of them are widely wrong. I've even been involved in some papers that argue for the right numbers in this area. Of course, it's important to account correctly for these different emissions. It's also important to be concerned about how is it, what are the different sort of contributions. So we have direct contributions of livestock with methane, both from the livestock itself and from the manures and so on. We should also include the emissions that are related to the feed that is produced for the livestock. And we should probably also include those emissions that are part of the land use changes, because we have a growing livestock production, right? So when you sort of account for all of this, right, you end up with about 15% of the global emissions. Now, emissions may be even larger, of course, if you also account for the emissions from the processing and so on that goes further with transportation and so on.
Okay.
By the way, do you know what the largest transportation contribution is with the livestock?
I would guess trucks.
No, it is the consumer's transportation to the supermarket.
Yeah, that was not even in the list of possibilities on my head. Yeah, that is okay.
And of course, there's also those emissions that are associated with the cooking and whatever you do with your food, right? So it becomes really big and, complex. Yeah.
Yes.
But anyway, what we look at is, so to speak, to the farm gate. Right, so to where the farm sort of finishes, and that's about 15%.
15.
Yeah.
Okay, good that we are done with this part. And the big question here is how does food production affect climate change and vice versa?
Yeah.
It is quite a complex answer, but I'm very much looking forward for what you're gonna say now.
So you're asking about the food production?
Yes. What's the relationship between the food production and climate change? And how does it affect one another?
I mean, we have these different sources of greenhouse gases, the CO2, the methane, the nitrous oxide, that are, some of them are sort of microbially mediated. It's microbes that generate them. But of course, we also, in agriculture, has a consumption of fossil fuels, so that needs to be included as well. And we have some emissions that are related to the clearing of land, because if we are using more and more land globally for the food production, and we need to do so because there's more people become more wealthy. When you're more wealthy, you eat more. Well, you do eat actually more, and you eat also differently. So you typically eat more animal-based foods. So that's why we have in particular rapid global increase of these meat and milk and those animal-based products. And those animal-based products, they have larger emissions associated with them if you calculate on per kilogram of produce.
Yeah.
Often about 10 times as much as compared to when it is plant-based. The reason for this is that energy and nutrients and so on are lost when you the animals eat it, right? And then convert it to meat and so on, because the animals in themselves, of course, also need to live, right? They consume energy, they consume nutrients and so on. They particularly consume energy if they live long, right? Which is why beef is much more emitting, has a larger climate footprint than chicken, for instance, right? Because chicken don't live very long. And there's another issue with the cattle. They have too few children.
Okay.
So a cow typically only get one calf per year, right?
It takes them long to grow.
It takes them long to grow, and you need to have a cow there all of the time just to have one offspring that you actually can produce meat on, right? So this sustaining all of these animals require energy. They're eating just to maintain themselves. It's different with chicken because a hen can produce one egg per day, right? So you have one new chicken every day, and it takes maybe 3-4 weeks, and then you've got a fully grown chicken. So the conversion from the plant-based, the grain, to the meat is much more efficient with that chicken than it is for a cow.
So is the future vegetarian or vegan?
I think the future is much more plant-based, right? I would not maybe. I think vegan and vegetarian is part of it, but I would say that maybe it's more like flexitarian or low sort of meat consumption. The fact is that we as humans are not really very well built for a vegan diet. We need additional vitamins and so on to function properly if we are only based on plant-based food. So we do need to care for our nutrition, right? Which is not just what we can get from a plant-based, because we are actually designed to have also some animal-based food.
Just reduce it is kind of the
we
key
just need
point.
to do, because we currently consume way too much, right? So that is the problem. We consume too much. It's not that we consume it, it's the amount. Okay, and what other things will have to change for this relationship become sustainable? Well, I think there are three things that we need to look at if we're looking at the sustainability of our food production systems and agriculture and so on. One thing is technology for the food production, also both with the land and the crops, and but also with livestock and so on. How we can make this much less, more sustainable and much less sort of consuming it, both in terms of resources and in nutrients being lost and the greenhouse gases emitted and so on. There are many different technologies we can work on, in both with the way we grow our crops, the way we manage our soil, how we fertilize the land, but also how we keep the animals, how we feed them, how we treat the manure and so on. Many different technologies can be used, need to come be implemented.
So they exist already. They just need to be
Some of them exist. However, some of them only exist up here in mine, right? They haven't really been tested, or even developed, right? So there's a huge need for research, for science, but also for innovation, looking at new, more sustainable ways of doing it. I would say thinking out of the box, right? Because we have actually in agriculture been very much thinking within the box, within the same box that we've been in for the past about 6,000 years, where we've been growing the crops and we've been having the livestock and sort of having this sort of in a cycle.
We didn't change.
we're still, even within the conventional agriculture, we're doing that, and it's of course the same with the organic. I mean, even more so with the organic, because we've sort of made an even bigger sort of, or I would maybe even a smaller box, right, with the organic farming, because we put some constraints on ourselves with the organic farming. Saying,
what do you mean by some constraints?
Because in organic farming, we've been constraining ourselves from the use of artificial fertilizers, with the use of pesticides in particular. There's also some concerns for how we have our animals and so on, the animal welfare, which of course is a good thing there. But I would say in particular with the fertilization and with the pesticide use, there some, and also with the use of genetically modified crop plants and so on, there's some technology constraints on the organic farming. The consequence of this is, you can argue, of course, that reduces the risk of having contaminated food and so on, which of course it does. So you don't have the risk of pesticide residues and so on in your food, which is a good thing. But there's a downside to it as well. The downside is that we have much lower production, much lower yields on organic farmed land than we do with a conventional farm. In particular, if also the conventional farming, if they're both managed well, I would say, right? So in Denmark, we typically only have half the yield per area in organic farming that we do in conventional. This means that you need to produce the same. You need twice as much land. For this.
So this is not sustainable. This is not a solution.
It's not the solution, I would say, because the solution we need is eventually to use less land for
and this
our
does exactly
food.
The opposite.
And that will go in the opposite direction. Okay, then you could argue that but you should go for the plant-based food, right? So that you could actually go for organic farming with more plant-based, and then that would solve the situation. You still need less land. Yes, I understand the argument, but that's not so easy in reality, because in reality, even crops that we grow organically need to be fertilized. In organic farming, we do it with manure. Where do you get your manure? You get it from your livestock, right? So you have, even in organic farming, a much higher dependency on your livestock, because they provide the manure, the fertilizers we need to grow our crops. So in the organic farming, you're actually depending on the livestock to an even greater extent, and even more so on the ruminant livestock, so the cattle that burp the methane, right? So you end up having potentially a much higher dependency on the livestock. It's more difficult to get out of with if you were to work with the organic farming. What we actually need, I think, is to revisit this organic farming. I do agree that pesticide is not such a good thing. We should try to get out of it, have other solutions for this. I can also think of many that could be done. But I would go for some artificial fertilizers, in particular nitrogen, but produced not on fossil fuels, based on fossil fuels, but produced based on renewable energy, wind or solar.
Is this possible?
This is possible, yeah.
Okay. Has it been done before, or somewhere in the world?
It's been done in a few places in the world. The problem, of course, is fossil fuels are still much cheaper, right? But it is being considered also right now here in Denmark to do so, because we have surplus wind power, right? So one of the way of converting this wind power into something we can actually store is to convert the nitrogen we have in the atmosphere to ammonia. This is one way of actually storing that energy, and ammonia can directly be used as a fertilizer in agriculture.
Okay. And do you think it's gonna, like you mentioned,
I think it's going to happen.
Yes.
I think it's going to happen in conventional agriculture, actually, not in organic, right? So I think we'll see more quickly the conventional agriculture become more sustainable than we do with the organic. Yeah.
Okay. And just still about the organic farming, and also related to the eco labels that we see. So the eco labels that we see in the products in the supermarket or wherever we get our food from, they are directly related to organic farming, right?
Yeah, it's the same thing. When you see this eco label, that is the EU label for organic produce, right?
Yes.
And in Denmark, we follow those EU guidelines for the organic farming. Yeah. So whether you see this sort of red Danish organic label or it's the eco label, it's the same thing.
Okay, and but we just talked about how this is actually not the solution, and people usually think, and this is the common thought, let's say, that when you buy eco-labeled products, you're contributing to a better environment. We just saw that that's actually not the case. So what other suggestions do you have? What can consumers do to help out with this?
Reduce waste, right? This is another part of what we need to do. We need to reduce the waste, and there are many also sources of waste. And of course, what the consumer can do is to make sure that you don't waste the food that you actually buy. Of course, you don't buy too much. You actually make sure you plan to spend all of it, right, and not just throwing it out. Yeah. The supermarket thing is a different aspect, actually, because in some cases it is difficult in supermarkets to manage this properly, because there's a time by which the food becomes too old, right? In order to sell it. Yeah, so sometimes they sell it a bit more cheap. Okay. Yeah. So you can go and buy the old food. Right,
so that would be
another possibility. But there's also a lot that can be done in the food industry to actually reduce the waste, and they have been doing quite a lot because it actually makes sense from an economic perspective. For instance, and I can give an example. So if we take the dairies, those that produce the milk and so on, process the milk, and they produce, for instance, cheese. When you produce cheese, you have a byproduct which is whey, and the whey, if you go back in time, right, it wasn't really wasted, but it went back to the farms and it was used to feed the small livestock, right? So was used as the feed. That's not the case anymore. In the dairies, this whey is upgraded. The protein in the whey is used to provide a food ingredient, a high protein ingredient that is used widely in the food industry now. So this makes very good sense because it reduces the need for other sources of protein. Same thing is happening also now in Denmark with the potato starch production, right? We produce, there are factories in Jutland also that takes potatoes and make potato starch out of it. As a side product of this, you also have protein. Because the potatoes also contain the protein part of it. So back in time, this was just a waste product that was just, really wasted. Now that is also upgraded to a protein ingredient for the food industry. So there's a lot of this sort of things that could be done much better, which reduces the overall waste and then the need to have the production in the first place.
And this is one of the three topics that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and the third thing is, of course, our diets, right? Which is very much about us consuming much less of the animal-based food, so less meat in particular. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is quite a complex.
And you know that there's been these global studies, right? That's looked into the importance of each of these. And the conclusion is, and it's very simple, we cannot meet these sustainability criteria by only looking at one of them. We need to do all of it. which makes things rather simple, right? Because you don't have to choose, you have to do it all.
Yeah, I guess I guess that's the perspective. This sounds quite complicated still, but you have also mentioned that we have this kind of a deadline until 2050 to get all of this done. Otherwise,
the politicians have set this deadline, right? In reality, we should do it earlier.
Okay.
It's probably just not possible.
Okay.
Right? Because the thing is, things take time, right? And when it comes to agriculture, food, and so on, we have really a lot of actors involved in this. There's the farmers, there's the food industry, there's the suppliers,
there's
many different. And if you look at it at the global level, right, it's even more complicated because at the global level we have 500 million farmers. 500 million.
Okay, I did not expect such a big number.
Because there's if you go to the global level, right, there's many very smallholder farmers and subsistence farmers and so on, which also is a problem, right? Because if you want to have all of those farmers converting to more sustainable practices, it's a huge effort in terms of educating, training, and so on, which actually is probably not possible. If you look at China, they actually now have a policy to say, okay, we should have fewer farmers. We should have farmers that are more professional, that farm bigger land and so on, and where they can do it in a better way. They've even looked at what are the environmental impacts of small-scale farming and large-scale farming, and they find that the larger-scale farming have lower environmental impact. They have both higher yields and lower environmental impact. Because they can do it professionally, because they're trained for it.
Yeah. And they also have a lot more resources.
Yeah, they often do that as well,
Yeah. Well, and do you think that this this deadline is something quite critical, let's say? Do you think it's going to work?
No. But the problem is, can we at all meet that deadline? Because if we look back in time, right, I started working on these aspects back in the 1980s. This is almost 40 years ago. And back then we had this challenge of too much nutrients being leaking from agriculture and so on. And now we've been working on that for 2, 3, 4 decades. We're still not meeting the targets. Okay. I can hope, of course, that we would have a much more speedy process with the climate and targets and emissions and so on. But they're actually much more challenging than what we had to deal with back then, and where we've not met the target. So I think it is going to be, it's not impossible, I wouldn't say that, but it's going to be challenging beyond belief. Okay. Let's see if we make it. Fingers crossed. And now that we are in our on our last 5 minutes, I would like to ask you about this roadmap project that you are doing here in Denmark. Yeah, we've been, and that's with all of the Danish universities and the food industry, agriculture, and so on. We've been joining forces to develop a plan, a plan for how we can conduct the research, the innovation, the implementation, the demonstration, and all of this that needs to take us on a road where we meet all of these sustainability criteria that I mentioned, both having greater food production, having a land with biodiversity, having less nutrients leaking, having climate neutral agriculture and food production and so on. So we've looked into which technologies and land uses and so on needs to be done there, what research innovation that should support this. We've also looked at how we could better promote plant-based food that would be also palatable for consumers eventually. We've looked at how our livestock industry could also be changed to have low emissions and more efficiency and so on. And finally, we've looked at, because if we're going to feed more people on less land, we need to be substantially more efficient. Which also means all of those side streams and so on, waste streams that we have, we should use them finally also for food in some sort of way, which requires new thinking about how we produce some of the currently animal-based foods, which is milk and meat. And with the milk, we could produce that not in a cow, but in a big fermenter, which is a steel tank. So in a steel tank, we have microorganisms then. We'll have yeast, genetically modified yeast that then produces the ingredients of milk.
So it's like vegan milk? But
no, it's not, because vegan milk is taking like oats or something like that, or almonds and so on, and just basically squeezing it with water and so on, and then you get an oat milk drink, right? It's not milk. It's a it's a
substitute
drink. No, this what you produce in with these in these steel tanks would be something that have the same components as milk would be, or maybe almost actually, but produced much more efficiently, right? Because it's done with these microorganisms. You don't need the cow to do it. So this is already being done. There's even a factory now being built in Denmark to produce this at Kalundborg. Near where also the Novo Nordisk have their producing facilities. But it's already been marketed for some time in California.
But so it's still quite recent, basically.
Yeah, it is quite recent. There'll be more of these things coming, I'm sure.
And this is what you're working on, and these new things?
Yeah, others are working at the university on these things. It's called fermenting, but precision fermenting. Precision in the sense that we produce exactly those components of the milk that we need. The other thing that is coming up is the stem cell-based meat. Where we have stem cells taking out of the animal, and then you grow them under particular conditions and so on, and they reproduce themselves and produce a meat-like thing. It's difficult to have real beef and so on grown, right? But you can have something that look like minced meat.
Wow. That's like such a weird concept, thinking about meat
and you
growing
can
up.
Again, do that much more efficiently than if it was a real animal. And of course, you don't have the ethical issues, or you have other ethical issues, because you may not have to think about animal welfare anymore.
Yeah, we need to think about other things. There's always. Well, I think this is a nice time to finish the program. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing everything with us.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for staying with us. See you next time.